Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank. This is episode number 6 already. We're on 6. That's kind of surprising. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be one of your hosts today. Joining me from the other side of the country, North Carolina, Mr. Teld. How you doing today?
I am doing very well. It's a nice sunny Sunday, so I'm probably going to go for a walk after this, or maybe get sucked into two drafts, because that appears to be what we're doing today.
Same. Over here in Washington, it decided to drop from like 75 degrees to like 50 degrees over the course of a week, so the walks have gotten a lot colder. It's something I'm still adjusting to, being on the other side of the country here. No Chris today. Chris is still living his best life. I don't think he's actually in Turkey anymore, but he also had a second leg of his vacation in the U.S. And I got to say, I'm a little bit jealous, Chris, if you're listening, because you were posting some pictures of some food from over there, and I'm going to need you to talk about it next time you're on an episode, which I think Chris will be joining us again for our next episode in 2 weeks, but I'm glad he's living his best life. But we get to trash talk him and everything. He's not going to listen to this. He's not going to hear any of this, so we can say whatever we want about Chris, and then we'll act like good boys next time when he's back. Today, me and Teld are going to do our Doctor Who Commander set review. We're going to sit down with the Commander decks, and hold on, I'm getting a message from Chris. He's saying, Okay, he's saying no Doctor Who on the podcast. Okay. Well, what should we do instead?
That's no good, Doctor because I actually agree with Chris, because Doctor Who is lame.
Oh gosh, that's really throwing a fandom under the bus there. I'm not going to get in between you and them. They can have you.
How about instead we talk about some differences between Cube and a regular retail draft? So I think there's some common misconceptions or mistakes people are making, and it might be from drafting in retail limited sets that doesn't really translate to our format.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot there that we're a Cube podcast, not a Commander podcast. I've been writing a lot of content for DraftSim.com and TheGamer.com about Doctor Who, so I've got Doctor Who on the mind, despite not knowing anything at all about the franchise. And I just got to say, last point on that, I'm kind of glad that we're not a Commander podcast, because those cards are complicated as hell, and there are almost 200 new ones. So
I really like the saga that went like 1, 2, then 3 is like back to 1 and then goes to 4.
There are some cool things going on. There is a saga that makes a creature with horsemanship, but also has vanishing, and then has like the other sagas can replicate it. It's very complicated. We don't have to talk about it. So, like Teld said, we're instead going to stick to our guns and talk about Cube Draft today. But we are going to talk about the differences between Cube Draft and Booster Draft. Retail Limited, we'll also be calling it in this episode. Kind of the impetus for this is we want to make something of an evergreen episode that we can point towards whenever we know somebody who wants to get into cube drafting but is maybe a little bit hesitant. And I know people off the top of my head, some of my closest friends who are really avid limited players. They love playing the new draft formats. They love playing sealed, going out to pre-releases and stuff like that. But whenever you mention cube draft to them, they say, that sounds really fun, but I don't know how to get into it. It's a little intimidating. Even if it's something like Arena Cube or, God forbid, Vintage Cube on Moto, the transition from just doing booster draft to actual cube drafting, the process is the same, but there's a lot of different ways you have to approach it, and that's what we're going to talk about. Before we get into that, just remember that you can support the Jank Tank, you can support Jank Diver Gaming by just finding us on Discord, hopping in that Discord server and saying hello, or coming out to draft our Peasant Cube, or coming out to draft our Unrestricted Cube and give us feedback so that we can sculpt those environments into the best cubes that we possibly can. Because as much as we don't want to admit it, they're not perfect. We could always use room for improvement, and that comes from our community members, the feedback that we get. So wherever you're listening to this podcast, there will be a link to that Discord, and you can come find us there, shout at us, come play with us. Good time.
Yeah, come yell at me about how Doctor Who is the greatest cultural thing ever created, and I'm an idiot. Look, I've already insulted the Commander community, the Doctor Who community. Do not worry, anime fans, you are next.
What happens, because we're getting, just as an aside here, we're getting Assassin's Creed and Final Fantasy Universes Beyond products next year. How do you feel about those?
So I'm not into Assassin's Creed, but Black Flag was really cool, the pirate one. Here's the thing, though. That the pirate parts of that game were super fun, but every time they made you do the assassin stuff, it just took a total nosedive. I am a huge Final Fantasy fan, though. I will admit I've been a fan of the series for a long time. Haven't really played the newer ones. I played a little of 14, the online one, and then haven't touched 15 or 16 yet. But I'll eventually get around to them. Final Fantasy 10 is one of my favorite games.
I know the Final Fantasy thing is coming to Arena, so we'll actually end up talking about that in the same vein as the Lord of the Rings set. I don't know about the Assassin's Creed one, and I could care less about that. There's Fallout, too, apparently. This is just a thing that's going to be happening from now forward, is like, what's this IP? They did the Princess Bride Secret Lair, and I had to write about that, and I actually had to sit down and watch The Princess Bride.
That is my that is my actual favorite movie.
Is it? You know, I know we're getting off topic here already, but I actually really enjoyed the movie. Just as a 30-something-year-old sitting down and watching it, like, it made me a little giddy. It was my first time watching it, and then I had to write about the Secret Lair, and I was like, you know what? The movie's good, but this Secret Lair is awful. Don't spend your money on it. It sucks. So,
yeah, I haven't really paid attention to any of this Universe Beyond stuff beyond the bare minimum. Even though I like Final Fantasy, and I'm a Fallout New Vegas fan, but I don't really want them on Magic cards, if I'm being totally honest. But here we are, so we'll deal with it.
Yep, we'll get to those when we get to those. We're literally getting Jurassic Park cards in this next set, which I don't think we have to talk about when we do the Ixalan set review, but getting way off topic here. Let's go ahead and jump back in here. The commentary that we're going to be doing here is assuming that the cube that you are engaging with is an 8-player, maybe even 10-player pod, and you're playing with the people in your pod. So if you sit down and you play on Arena or you play on Moto, usually you're doing league-style play where you draft with 8 other people or 7 other people, and then you just branch off and play anybody else who's available, whether they were in your pod or not. A lot of what we're going to say about Cube is assuming that maybe you're sitting down with friends who have a paper cube, or maybe you're coming to join us for an unrestricted cube on Sunday night. You are playing in pod, and that does shape up different things that you need to know about the cube. But let's go ahead and jump into this. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the first thing that comes to mind for people who are engaging with Cube for the first time is that majority of Cube environments are singleton formats. And retail/booster draft is not a singleton format. And that has a lot of implications, right? And I think one of the biggest ones is that there's only a single copy of every card. So when you see a card floating around in a cube draft, you know that that's the only copy of it. So if you draft a card, that means none of your opponents can have the card. It also means if you let a card go and it doesn't wheel, you have no more opportunities to get it, right? Whereas in a booster draft, you might first pick a powerful uncommon and still get another copy of that later on down the line. Or if you pass up on like a synergy common that you just really need in pack 1, you have other opportunities to get it later on. If you're going out with a friend and they're like, hey, come draft our cube tonight, you know, come hang out and draft our cube, there's kind of a expectation that it's singleton unless someone says otherwise. And if you break singleton, that's fine. People have reasons for breaking singleton. But correct me if I'm wrong, that's basically an underlying part of most cubes is that there's only one copy of every card floating around.
Right, and that's going to be true of, like you said, most regular cubes. I think of all the cubes that we have across Jank Divers, the only one that isn't singleton is our Neo cube, and that's because it was initially designed as like an adaptation of a set environment. So it's trying to like adapt a retail limited environment into a cube format. And so it does have 2 and 3 copies or 4 copies in some cases of cards. But that's a very specific reason we did that.
Does that matter much in booster draft? Does it matter that you can get additional copies of cards? Because I would say most limited decks probably only have like 2 or 3 duplicates anyway. And they're usually like commons or something like that. So what are the implications of shifting to a format where every card you pick is the only copy of that card?
I think it makes a big difference, to be totally honest with you, because there are a number of cards that are exceptionally powerful that you have to consider if your opponent has. But if you've got it, or if you've already played against somebody who has it, you know they can't possibly have that card. So a lot of times when I'm sitting there either drafting or playing, I'll be analyzing the fact that, like, for example, if I'm playing a deck with Wandering Emperor in it and my opponent holds up, 4 mana white, I can rule Wandering Emperor off of the list of cards they could possibly have. And that changes the way you're going to play, because maybe now I'm thinking about Settle the Wreckage or vice versa, right? Say I've got Settle, I can think about Wandering Emperor. And the difference is like Wandering Emperor heavily punishes you for attacking with a single creature. Settle the Wreckage blows you out for attacking with all your creatures. Mm-hmm. So if you know that one of those can't be on the table, you can make a more optimal decision, right? And that matters a lot. Additionally, there's things like playing aggressive decks and having Settle the Wreckage in your deck, knowing that it's a very powerful sideboard card for you that no one else can have, and you can know your control opponent doesn't have it. This is really, really common in Cube, to be honest. This happens like on a nightly basis, at least once or twice. You'll run through that mental calculus of I've already played against this, or I have this, or something along those lines, and play around things or not play around things because you know that your opponent can have them.
Yeah, and you don't really have to care about that in booster draft, right? First off, in gameplay, if I'm playing Ixalan, I'm just going to assume my opponent doesn't have Settle the Wreckage until I see it, right? Like, why am I playing around a rare? You normally don't play around Wraths in Limited unless you see them or you have a strong feeling that your opponent has one, which we'll talk about later on down the line. But in Cube, I know for a fact there's a copy of Settle the Wreckage somewhere in somebody's card pool. And if I didn't see it, I know somebody has it. And if I did see it and I passed it, I know somebody is going to have it, whether I play against them or not. And then let's say I get blown out by Settle the Wreckage in my first match, that means I'm clear for the rest of the matches. There can be no other Settle the Wreckage. So I can like cross off a card off my list or just be cautious of it if I haven't seen it yet, right? And you know, it's one of those things where in our community, if people finish up matches early, they usually go watch the last match as you would at a game store, right? And somebody will stream and you might see one of them cast Settle the Wreckage. And yeah, you're getting information about a match you didn't actually play in, but now you know who has it. And you know that nobody else can have it. And I think one implication that this brings up that does not really apply to booster draft at all is the idea of hate drafting. I don't know about you, but I tell people if they're looking for limited advice, one thing I usually tell them is hate drafting is useless, especially in league play, because you're not even going to play against the people in your pod. But even in pod play, like you go to F&M and you have an 8-person draft and you're going to play with the other people in your pod, hate drafting is basically useless. It makes your deck worse because you didn't take something for your deck, and it makes someone else's draft worse, and you're not even guaranteed to play against that person. But hate drafting, that's a real thing, right? That's a real thing in Cube environments, right, Teld?
Yeah, I mean, especially the most common example, and it comes up rather frequently, is if you're playing mono white, Settle the Wreckage is simultaneously a great card to take if you can hate draft it, because it's one of the best cards against you. But also, if you play against another creature deck, you can use it as a powerful sideboard card for yourself. So that's like hitting a double whammy. But hate drafting Wraths is a really common one. Hate drafting cards that are particularly good against control late into drafts. I would never hate draft over a card that is very good in my deck. But once I'm hitting the playable ceiling, or we're talking about filler cards and things like that, I think hate drafting makes a lot more sense. It's still got that issue of you're only impacting one other player at most. Mm-hmm. But the upside's a lot higher because a lot of times in Cube, you've got all the cards you want out of a pack early, like, you know, by pick 6 or something.
And it's one of those things where you also can't afford to hate draft in booster draft because you kind of need every pick. You need to take powerful cards when you see them. But when you're playing Cube, every card theoretically is powerful or has a home. So you have a couple flexible picks where you can give up a medium power level card to take something that is going to completely destroy you in a certain matchup. And you're still going to end up with your 23 playables plus 10 sideboard cards or whatever. Basically, you're taking a card, you're ripping it up, you're throwing it away because you can't play it, but you're playing mono red or something like that, or you're playing a bunch of green dorks and you recognize that a white Wrath will completely disrupt your deck, so you just take it out of the card pool. Nobody else can have it, and that's not true in booster draft. Like, it is possible if you sat down at a Wilds of Eldraine F&M draft or something and you hate drafted Expel the Interlopers, you know, the white Wrath, it's possible somebody else still opened Expel the Interlopers and they can cast it against you.
And similarly, if you pass a Torch the Tower to take an Imidage Recruiter, you could just get past one impact too. There's a different calculus you have to do. There's a different evaluation of cards that you have to do when you're retail drafting. But with the singleton, you can safely say, okay, this powerful card's out of the pool, or I have it, you know, and not have to worry about it. And that is a big change in terms of drafting analysis.
Yeah, and Torch the Tower is actually a great example because that's just a hyper-powerful common in a booster draft. I can first pick Torch the Tower and still play 3 matches in a row where my opponents all have Torch the Tower. You know, I'm not making my opponent's decks worse or anything like that. I'm still going to play against people who have super powerful stuff. But that doesn't happen in a singleton format. And of course, what we're talking about here doesn't apply if the format's not singleton, which we said some cubes just aren't singleton. They break singleton, and that's fine. But there are different rules of engagements with those sort of cubes, and we're kind of focusing on cubes that actually are singleton. And the last thing I want to mention in this kind of subcategory here is that if there are themes and there are support cards, like archetypal support cards in a cube, you can guarantee that they're floating around somewhere. The booster draft comparison I want to do here is the blue-white deck in Wilds of Eldraine. You know, the whole tap down my opponent's creatures for benefits type cards. There are a couple payoffs for that. There's cards like Shirai, which is the blue-white payoff. There's a mythic rare, Hilda, which is like the only reason to actually draft that deck. And then there's a couple sparse commons and uncommons that support that theme. It's not a very good deck, and part of the reason is that everything's common or uncommon or rare or mythic rare. So if you end up in that archetype, there's no guarantee that the cards that you need to make that deck come together even exist in the draft pod. Whereas if there is an archetype like that in Cube, supposedly the Cube designer has supported it, which means the support cards are floating around the cube somewhere. And you can see that with very niche archetypes, right? Like if there's a blue-black ninja deck or something like that in somebody's cube, you know that there are blue-black ninja support cards and they will be open and they should flow around the table. So if you are the person who's drafting that deck and nobody else is touching it, you'll get blue-black ninja cards. That's not actually guaranteed in booster draft, but it more or less is guaranteed in cube. And you won't get multiples of your payoff cards like you could in booster draft, but you know that the support cards are there somewhere. They're guaranteed to be open, assuming you're doing like a 360 card cube with 8 people. Once you go down to like 6 people, some of the cards might not be opened. But
right, yeah. And this comes up, you know, when you're drafting, for example, the Black Sack deck, you know somebody's opening Yawgmoth, right?
Yeah.
And if you're the person in that deck, you could get it passed. It's a card that if you aren't in that deck, Yawgmoth is super powerful, but you have to be in these kind of black, sacky, mid-range sort of decks for it to really be optimal. So it's not uncommon to see that card in Pack 2 or Pack 3 come around a little late, because if I'm playing blue-black control, I'm just not interested in it.
Yeah, and this does change when you go up to like, I think most arena cubes are like 540 cards, right? But when you go up to 540 cards in an 8-person pod, not everything's going to be guaranteed to be open. So you get things like the Splinter Twin Kiki-Jiki combos, where you might speculate on Pestermite or Deceiver Exarch, and then Kiki-Jiki just never gets opened. But if you're in a 360 card cube with 8 people, every card gets opened. And if Splinter Twin exists in that cube, in that sphere, then you know there's a Splinter Twin somewhere in the draft. And if nobody else wants it, it's going to make its way to you, which means that carving out a space in a certain niche archetype and just cutting it off from every player does mean that sometimes the cards get to you, whereas in a booster draft, you can't guarantee that. Like, people are just going to take the powerful cards, and they're not going to wheel, and they might not even be open.
Not to get too deep into their design decisions for MTG, you know, the wizard approved cubes, you know, it does add a lot of variance, which is probably good given the number of reps those cubes get, but it is really, really tilting to be trying to draft an archetype and have one of the very key cards not get opened, because there's a reasonable chance that it won't. I think it's something like 66% of the cube gets opened at any one time. So it's like you can be drafting the artifacts deck and Academy, Urza, and Tinker don't get opened, and it's, I mean, what are you going to do there?
And there's enough redundancy in cubes like that you can find something else to do, right? Obviously, the Vintage Cube, you're not going to be stuck with a non-functional deck. But the Vintage Cube, we can't really talk about it on this episode because it kind of defies a lot of the normal rules of cube drafting. So it's
that's like playing. It's the Magic equivalent of playing Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah. Which, you know, you would think Yu-Gi-Oh is the Magic equivalent of playing Yu-Gi-Oh, but it's not. So
the other thing that comes up a lot in Cube is the sort of one-card archetypes is a big thing. And these are slots where you use one slot in your cube to put in a card that maybe most decks aren't really interested in it. But but you can build a deck around it. And if you're playing 360 especially, this means you're always going to open it. So some examples of this are like Soul Herder, Yawgmoth, Mondrak, we're missing some of the really busted ones, obviously, like Opposition, but there's a number of those. Monastery Mentor is another example, kind of facilitating a number of different decks. It's not really something you're going to want a base white deck, right? Monastery Mentor just doesn't do much because white doesn't have enough cards that trigger it. You might be able to get some value out of it, but it's really for these kind of 3-color white adjacent decks, so like Mardu Pyromancer style decks or Jeskai, where you're playing a lot of cantrips. And these sort of cards don't take up a lot of real estate, but they open up a lot of very powerful lines of play and deck building decisions that add some extra variance to very tight cubes.
Yeah, and it just knowing that card exists in the pool somewhere means that you always have a shot at drafting it. Or if you see that card first pick and you like go in on it, that archetype is there. And let's use an example like Yawgmoth here.
Oh, I love first picking Yawgmoth.
Yeah, exactly. In our unrestricted cube, let's say you don't first pick Yawgmoth, but you're in black-white aristocrats, and Yawgmoth is like the most important card that you can get. You always have a shot. All the way up until pack 3, pick 8, the final pick where you see new cards. You know that Yawgmoth always has a chance of making it to you, especially if you were able to cut off the archetype. But let's say you're drafting in Modern Horizons, where Yawgmoth was printed, booster draft, and you're building a deck around Yawgmoth, but you don't have Yawgmoth yet, right? Like, you're not going to get Yawgmoth. It's not going to come to you. You just can't guarantee that. So this is all to say, this whole category is to say that a singleton format basically guarantees that a card exists in the card pool, right? And whether you have it or not, somebody has it in their card pool guaranteed, whereas in booster draft, there's no guarantee your opponent has anything at all. You can't promise anything in booster draft, but you can kind of make promises in cube draft. And whether you get your cards or not, can't say. But let's go and talk about lands.
Yeah, if you get those cards, you got to be able to cast them.
Yeah, if you are an avid limited drafter, booster drafter, and you have never played cube, I think one of the biggest shocks is the lands, the mana base, right? You will open a pack of cube cards in your draft, and you'll notice 4 or 5 of the slots are just lands, just dual lands, no utility or anything, just 2-color lands. And you will notice people's cube decks often end up with 4, 5, 6 dual lands or something like that. Sometimes even more, like once you get to the point of like 10, 11 dual lands in your 3, 4-color deck, and your normal booster draft mana base is like 9, 8 basics, or
one tap land,
Yeah, you've got your Blossom and Sands as your green-white tap land. It gains you a life. There's your utility. And then, 8/8. And it has been well documented that booster draft mana bases are not good. There are some formats that have cycles of common dual lands or uncommon dual lands, and you can make your mana base a little bit better.
Yeah, notably some formats like, Cons, DMU, Neo, these were formats where the dual lands were very high priority cards. But
March
in your
Machine.
Yeah, in your average set, I think it's very, very low priority. These are cards you're looking to pick up very late into the draft, if at all. And that is not how Cube plays at all. These lands are very, very high priority.
Well, why is that? So for the person who is trying to get into their first Cube draft, they're trying to get an understanding for why. Like, why is it that the dual lands are such high picks? People wouldn't be playing booster draft if the 9/8 mana base just never worked. Obviously that's sufficient for booster draft. Why is it that lands suddenly become such high picks in a cube environment?
So there's kind of a couple things going on here. Firstly is that Wizard has a tendency to print a lot of the really powerful cards with multiple colored mana symbols, which isn't necessarily something you see in booster draft, right? In booster, a lot of times your 2, your 3, your 4 drops only have 1 mana pip, whereas a card like Adeline is 1 white, right? And it's exceptionally powerful. And if you're playing a multicolored deck with Adeline in it, you need to be able to cast that. But what if you're also trying to play, Seasoned Pyromancer in your Adeline deck? That's a pretty big stretch, and I would usually try to avoid it. But if that's something you're doing, you need your mana to be very good to be able to facilitate red, and white early into the game. Additionally, the cards are so much more powerful that stumbling on your mana, like if you open up a hand that's really, really powerful, but it's got 2 basics of your color and no second color, you just have to mulligan that most of the time. You can't keep it because your opponent's just going to run you over. The cards are so much more powerful that being able to cast them becomes much more important. You can't take a turn off. And honestly, this is becoming more true in retail limited as well. Like stumbling in WoD just is instant death.
Most limited formats are set up where if you get stuck on your third land, the game's probably over now. And I don't think that's always been the case, but I do think that's true. But not only is it I have powerful spells in cube, I want to cast my powerful spells, but my opponent is going to have powerful spells in their deck. So if I stumble, I'm going to get run over by their powerful stuff. And that's not necessarily always true in Booster Draft, right? Because your opponent's 2-drop in Booster Draft is going to be a 3-1 with like maybe some minor upside.
Or a
and
bear.
if you stumble on a land, you can make it up for that later on down the line, whereas your opponent's 2-drop in cube is always going to be that Kyrion Dryad or whatever that's going to be, or Kyrion
Luminarch Aspirant, Misery Shadow.
Aspirant. Yeah, these creatures that compound every time they play a new card and just do so much. Basically, all of the bomb 2-drops that your opponents could have in Booster Draft are going to be your opponent's regular plays in Cube Draft, and that means you can't stumble. So you need your colors, and that makes the lands high picks in Cube. In fact, I think I said when we did our Peasant Cube Draft, my biggest piece of advice was take your dual lands at, premium points in the draft. Like, I don't know if I would first pick pack one, pick one, a Triome or something like that, but once I know that I am Simic, Breed and Pool becomes maybe my number one priority, even over some of the gold cards, like the Mother Goose or something. If I'm in pack 2 and I don't have Mana Fixin' yet, and I see Breed and Pool, I'm taking Breed and Pool over every single conceivable card in that cube because I need to be able to cast my spells on time.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed about our really successful drafters is, generally speaking, if you look, they almost always have 4 or 5 dual lands by the time the draft is over. They take them very aggressively, and it causes you to stumble less, which means you're able to keep more hands. And as we all know, mulliganing has a direct correlation with your win rate. You don't want to be mulliganing very often. And the better your mana, the less often you have to do that. The more often you can keep sketchy hands, right? You could keep a 2-lander because you have both your colors.
Yeah, and this is huge for Boros, right? Boros is kind of the poster child of you need lands to make this work. A lot of people will tell you in, say, Vintage Cube that mono white or mono red are individually better than straight up white red because they don't have to worry about grabbing their lands. They can just deploy their 1-drop into their 2-drop into their 3-drop. But once you mix a second color in and you're opening up a hand that has a white Savannah Lions, a white 2-drop, but you drew your red sources, you don't get to curve out, and that's the death knell for the aggro deck, right? So if you are an aggro deck that relies very heavily on going 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, and that needs to be your game plan, you have to have the lands to make sure you can always deploy your 1-drop. You said last time, too, that one way to mitigate this is to bias towards a certain color. If you are a 2-color Boros deck, you bias your 1-drops towards a single color, and you make sure you're playing enough pips. But even in our cubes, if you're Boros, you probably want to make sure you end the draft with all 4 of the Boros lands, or else it feels like your deck's just not going to be consistent enough.
Yeah, and I mean, I even don't even draft Boros aggro that often, but I'm a fan of the Boros mid-range deck that's kind of been cropping up lately. And even in it, though, the lands are so important because if I'm trying to cast a 2-drop into Adeline, into Chandra 4, right, the sort of mid-range curve, then I need my mana to be good because I'm trying to cast a white spell on turn 2, or turn 3, excuse me, and then a red spell oftentimes on turn 3. I need all of those lands in order to make this deck work. It's just a very mana intensive deck to get all of the best cards in a color. And that's what these mid-range decks are trying to do, is leverage higher average card quality to make up for the fact that they're not quite as synergistic as some of the other decks.
I take lands like gospel. I take them very, very highly once I know that I'm even touching a color. And part of the reason, which is well documented in Limited, it's well documented for cubers and stuff like that. Part of the reason that you can afford to just take a land over like a premium card is that every single card in the cube theoretically is powerful, and you will not be short on cards, right? If you were drafting, I don't know, what's a limited format that has a bunch of dual lands in it? March of the Machine, right?
That DMU is my go-to for that, because that's probably the format I've played the most dual lands, that Neo.
Yeah, and DMU, the dual lands were actually very important for like the domain decks and stuff like that. So that's a good example. You can take lands in DMU. In fact, you kind of have to make some of the decks work, but you can't use 10 draft picks on lands and expect to have 23 good playables in booster draft, right?
Right.
But you could do that in cube because the cards are so individually powerful that all you need really is 23 cards regardless of what they are, and you have functional cards in your deck. There really isn't filler in cube. You're not going to have all A pluses and S's in your deck, but you can afford to take a land over like a B plus quality card because there are just so many other B plus cards going, and you get to play more cards in your pool, right?
Right. We're going to get into this in a second. I probably speculate on lands less than you do, but once we're in the color pair, once I know I'm playing, red, green, or Boros or whatever, those draft picks, the lands become the absolute top priority beyond, like, if I'm in pack 2, maybe I'll take something like a Wandering Emperor or a Chandra 4 over it. But if I'm in pack 3 and my mana sucks, I might take a Boros dual land over Chandra at that point. If my card, my card quality is good and I just need lands, you make the sacrifices.
Yeah, like pack 1, pick 1, you see Chandra and you see Sacred Foundry. You're taking Chandra every time, right? And in fact, I don't know how anybody could ever justify taking Sacred Foundry, pack 1, pick 1 over Chandra. But pack 3, you could conceivably find yourself in a situation where you need to take Sacred Foundry over Chandra. And this is something that you don't have to worry about too much in booster draft because there just aren't that many dual lands and stuff like that. There are usually utility lands floating around, but at most your mana base in limited and booster draft ends up being like 7, 8, and like 2 tap lands or something like that, and that's like a typical scenario, whereas your average mana base in cube ends up being like 10 lands, 6 duels or something like that.
Yeah, you want very, very consistent mana bases.
And again, if you're just coming into cube for the first time and you're listening to this episode, that is the biggest piece of advice I can give you is once you know your colors, value your lands as though there's no going back, or be monocolor and forget about this conversation. Even then, if you are monocolored, I value the utility lands very highly because you just get to add power to your mana base.
One shout out is as an early speculative pick. If you think you're going to be a monocolor aggressive deck, Sunbaked Canyon is both great in mono white and in mono red. So if you're an aggro gamer, that one probably jumps up just a little bit in terms of pick order. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you want to have like these sack lands, which just in general, if you're in a monocolor deck, draft the Horizon Canopy style lands, the ones that allow you to sack to draw a card. Draft those a little higher. They're really, really good in 1 and even 2 color decks if you can use one of the colors because it prevents flooding, which is great. But Mutavault's another great card you can use for this slot.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're in mono white, pick up the Cave of the Frost Dragon. Is that what it's called?
I believe so. Yeah.
Pick up the Amiria's Call. Pick up the Castle Ardenvale, which we don't play, but some people have Castle Ardenvale because now not only are you playing 23, 24 powerful cards in your spell slots, but your lands just got better, and you have like quote unquote functional spells in your land slots too. So lands, just draft lands highly. Don't draft them over S tier quality cards. Don't take a land over a Swords to Plowshares basically ever. But know that you need to cast your spells on time. You can't stumble in cube. If you stumble, GG's. Like, I would say they're probably, if you want to put a letter grade on them, they're like B plus to A plus quality range. And then once you know you're in a color pair, they're like S tier. Yeah. The lands become S tier.
Much like in real life, invest in property. It's a great long-term plan.
Yeah, and this whole conversation is like kind of assuming that you're a 2-color deck most of the time. We could get into 4 and 5-color decks too, in which case you need like 10, 11, 12, 13 dual lands or something like that.
This is my Roto deck. I have like 5 basics in my deck, right?
Yeah, you will sometimes see the Field of the Dead type decks just not play a basic land. We have seen people draft decks where they do not have basics. It's just 17 dual lands or something like that. Which I don't know if I would advise doing that. You almost always want to have a couple basics. But let's move on. Effects that you should be anticipating in cube draft that you don't necessarily have to worry about too much in booster draft. The biggest one, the number one biggest thing that you can expect in cubes, the average cube, not anything thematic, are the wrath effects. Cubes will have wraths. However, when you booster draft, you don't normally have to worry about a wrath. I would say the average limited format has like 2 rare wraths that destroy all creatures or something like that, and then maybe an infest, like a -2/-2 effect, or a deal 1 damage to all creatures, or if you're Hour of Devastation, you just have 17 wrath effects for some reason at rare. So, in Hour of Devastation draft, you should expect your opponent to have a wrath, but in Wilds of Eldraine, are you ever playing the game assuming that your opponent has a wrath effect? They exist in the format, but you don't really warp your strategy around your opponent having one unless they're playing in a really particular manner or it's game 2 and they've already shown you one, right?
Yeah, I would say the only retail formats that's recently that's been not true in is like maybe Neo and especially Mom. And Mom, like Sunfall, was kind of a big enough game that you would consider if your opponent played white that was a reason to be in white. But outside of those narrow circumstances with Farewell and Sunfall just being absolute game enders, I think generally speaking in retail limited, you're just not playing around a Wrath, whereas it's very common. There's going to be archetypes where you know that they are very likely to have a Wrath in cube.
Yeah, you can look at the cube list that you're drafting ahead of time, assuming that it's online or something, and you know for a fact there's a Wrath floating around. Like, again, going back to your F&M Wilds of Eldraine, there's no guarantee anyone opened Expel the Interlopers. Like, you have no reason to think that unless you saw it or someone showed it to you or someone's playing like that game where they're just not putting creatures on board for some reason despite getting beat down. Like, you can play around a Wrath, but when you transition to cube, if you come join us on Sunday for Unrestricted, I'm going to tell you now, there's like 4 white Wraths in the card pool, and somebody has those in their deck. Usually, a control player will have 2 or 3 of them, and then just because you played against them in that match, like match 1, doesn't mean that you're safe from Wraths moving on. Somebody else, you might play against a black opponent next who has Crux of Fate and Languish in their deck, right?
There was a week, I guess it was like a month or 2 ago, where I literally got Languished 4 times in one game.
Yeah. It's rough. It's rough. And this matters a lot when you are drafting a creature-based deck, right? You should not only be cautious of Wraths, but you should recognize the fact that they exist. And this goes for most cubes. I would say almost every cube should have, if it's being built responsibly, it should have a safety valve for whatever the most important thing going on in that cube is. So even in my artifact cube, I have artifact Wraths, right? Because it's a safety valve for whatever the theme of the cube is. And most cubes end up being like creature-centric, combat-centric cubes, like ours. I would say ours fall into that category, which means you need Wraths for the people who get really far ahead. You need a reset button that can, keep up with people's 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop starts. And that means as the creature player, you should expect them. They're there, and you will play against them. Yeah,
more than average, our cube is skewed towards creatures intentionally to make the Wraths a little bit better as a count. That way you can't just play a non-creature permanent and screw your opponent over if they're playing control. You need to consider Wraths a lot in our cube. It's something that when you're playing an aggressive deck, you have to think about. So a lot of times you're left with that decision of like, okay, going into turn 4, do I want to leave a mana open for Mana Tithe or 2 mana open for Reprieve or whatever in my mono white deck, or maybe in my aggro deck, do I want to sandbag a haste creature and maybe play something else that doesn't play to the board this turn to try to minimize that?
Yeah, this is where that hate drafting comes into play, right? Because if I'm playing like mono white aggro, for example, and it's pick 7, and my pick is between Blade Splicer and nothing else, but I already have Adeline, I already have Elite Spellbinder, and maybe I'm looking at Blade Splicer versus there's a Wrath sitting in the pack, I might just take the Wrath out of the card pool, rip it up so nobody can play it against me, and just give up on Blade Splicer, right?
I'd say this is especially true of Languish, because the drop-off from Languish to Crux of Fate, the only other Black Wrath, outside Mehook, which is an entirely separate combo because it's a high pick regardless. But like Languish is really good, and Crux is pretty mediocre. So if you take Languish, you've slowed your opponent's possible Wrath down by a full turn. It's a little different with the White Wraths because there's like 2 or 3 4-mana White Wraths.
And I wouldn't say, you shouldn't hate draft as a rule, but there are situations where if you're not adding something super powerful to your deck, it is maybe worth it as the creature deck to try and remove a Wrath from the pool. You see this a lot in the Roto drafts in particular, where you hate drafting becomes like something super important in roto drafting because you're guaranteed to play against the person who has the Wrath. It's going to happen. So removing that Wrath from the card pool means you just don't have to play against it. There's no chance for them to have that particular card.
Yeah, what else might we run into in Cube that is maybe a little different than retail draft?
So I wrote down counter magic here. And that's not to say that you don't face against counter magic in retail limited. Wilds of Eldraine, good example of this. I would say the blue decks kind of live or die by spell stutters and ice outs, right?
Right.
But your average blue deck might have 2 spell stutters and an ice out. In fact, your average blue deck in that format might just have 1 and 1. Like, you might be playing against a deck that has 2 counter spells. Maybe they went overboard, they have 3 or 4 counter spells. And then if you're not playing against blue, you're not playing against counter spells at all. But if you're playing against a control deck in Cube, not only are they going to have counter spells, but they might, not always, but they might have a deck that's like 10, 11, 12 counter spells, like 12 pieces of stack interaction or something like that, because their whole plan is to counter everything you do and then win with a finisher. Not that that strategy always works or anything like that. We talked about it in episode 2, you know, why blue doesn't do so hot these days with that strategy. But you should anticipate more counter magic, assuming that the Cube developer has planted some sort of control deck. There are Cube developers I know who are so adverse to counter magic and stuff like that that they just don't add it to the Cube at all. I think the arena cubes, like the Tinker's Cube and the Chromatic Cube, they kind of cut back on counter magic a lot because people just don't like playing against them.
Yeah, they'll usually run like counterspell, but then after that they drop off and give you a lot of the really bad counter magic. So in like the Chromatic Cube, they were playing like Spell Swindle. It's like a 5-mana counterspell. And I mean, It's actually not the worst thing ever there just because there's so many bomb diggities going on, but it's not a card I'm really excited to play in that cube. Whereas in our environment, you know, you've got a ton of 2-mana counterspells. And if your opponent plays blue sources, they are probably playing a counterspell somewhere in their 75 or their 40 plus sideboard. Almost said 75, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, just for reference, I'm looking at our unrestricted cube right now, 360 card cube. Between mana values 1 to 2, there is Spell Pierce, Stern Skolden, Censor, Change the Equation, Counterspell, Essence Scatter, Make Disappear, Memory Lapse, Negate, Reject.
There's also Mana Tithe and Reprieve, which are white counterspells that we
Yeah. White stack interaction as well. So you're talking about like some percentage of the cube is just counterspells because that's a strategy that we want represented. We want control represented in our cube. We want the 3 pillars, you know? And most cubes, I think cubes that aren't trying to do something very specific kind of follow that same strategy. So I would anticipate, let me know if you agree with this or not, but if I sit down for one of our unrestricted cube drafts, I just assume off the top of my head that I'm going to play against at least one aggro deck, at least one control deck, and something mid-rangey. Obviously, that's not a formula like that persists from week to week. You might play against 2 aggro decks, you might play against 2 control decks, you might just play against mid-range soup, 5-color, stuff like that. But I draft as though I am going to play against at least one aggro player and at least one control player throughout the night. And I anticipate that that control player is going to have 3, 4, 5 counter spells of some sort if they're dedicated to control.
Right, yeah. When you're drafting, especially when you get into the phase where you're looking at sideboard cards, you're definitely going to be considering, okay, this card's good against aggro, or this card's good against control. What's my game plan going to be? What am I cutting? What am I, those are things you do start thinking about. Whereas that's less common in retail limited, particularly because most people at this point are playing Premier Draft, which is best of 1 where you don't even think about it. But even in best of 3, a lot of times you don't have a lot of options for sideboarding beyond a few minor tweaks. And some formats are more or less forgiving to sideboarding. Yeah, I think you're really considering that pretty aggressively in your draft. I usually assume I'm playing against like 2 mid-range decks, but that's I always try to consider an aggro and a control deck. What is my sideboard plan against them?
You should at the very least have a plan against a control deck at any given point. Like when you're drafting your cube draft, at least in our unrestricted cube, you should at some point in the draft say, what is my plan against a counterspell heavy deck, like against a control deck?
Yeah, I've had a few drafts where my entire deck folded to a turn 4 Wrath of God and paired up against a control opponent. They turn 4 Wrath of God me and I top righted. It's like, okay, well, I didn't exactly prepare for this enough. So, Tim, for the last thing that comes up in Cube that maybe you don't see as often in Booster Draft, can we talk about how much you love Thoughtseize and how it's you getting playing with and against Thoughtseize is your favorite thing in all of Magic? You are a true Jund gamer at heart.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thoughtseize, look, I know we're only on episode 6 here, but I've probably said it like 5 times throughout the course of those episodes. Getting Thoughtseized is the most visceral feeling that I have in Magic. And it's not just because they get to take away my best card, it's that they know the information. I think I said this with Gitaxian Probe, right, in the Cantrip episode. Mm-hmm. I hate when people know the cards in my hand. Look, they can make me discard all they want, but you're breaking the gentleman's agreement about hidden information when you know the cards in my hand and I don't know the cards in your hand. So I hate getting Thoughtseized But that doesn't mean that I would like cut Thoughtseize from a cube or something like that, or from constructed formats. I think targeted hand disruption, Chris has identified that the targeted hand disruption in black is basically the best thing that black can do. At least it's the most universal thing that black can do, and it's super important that black has access to it. So your Thoughtseizes, your Inquisition of Causal X. In Retail Limited, your discard effects are usually the virus beetles. At least nowadays they are, right? These little value creatures that maybe make your opponent discard a card, or Wilds of Eldraine has a Hopeless Nightmare, right? You just get a card out of your opponent's hand, but they get to pick what the card is, and maybe you get some value off of whatever the card was later on down the line. But in Cube, you should anticipate the targeted hand disruption effects. Maybe that means you're the black drafter, and you should anticipate getting those effects rather than being on the receiving end. The question is, what does that mean? Let's say that I tell you you're going to come to our draft tonight, and there's going to be a cube that has Thoughtseize, Inquisition, and Duress and stuff like that. Does that change the way you play or the way you draft or the way you anticipate your black opponent who goes like Swamp on turn one and doesn't play anything? Does this change the way that you approach the draft?
A little bit, yeah. I think it makes me value redundancy, especially in my aggressive decks. You want to obviously have a very high number of 1-drops, because if you get Thoughtseized in your aggro deck, the opponent takes your only 1-drop. Let's say you're playing like 5 or 6 instead of the like 8 you want to be playing, so that you have a couple of them. If you get Thoughtseized, they take your 1-drop, and then they Doomblade your 2-drop, you might as well pack that game up in a lot of cases. You're just not getting into that game against your opponent's higher card quality. Also, decks that rely very, very heavily on a single card. Some of the ramp decks I like to draft can get into a little bit of trouble with this if you're not careful, which is, again, we've talked about the green cantrips, but part of their power. But if your opponent can Thoughtseize you and take your only threat, and you're just left with a handful of mana dorks and they don't do anything, like now you're at the mercy of top decks, your opponent can do things. Also, there's a couple of kind of combo-y things you can do in the cube. Technically speaking, there's like a Time Warp, Cyber Siphoner, Soul Herder thing you can put together. And if your deck is the kind of deck that folds to my opponent Thoughtseizes me, so now my entire deck doesn't do the thing, you're probably going to be in a little bit of trouble, because you're going to play against somebody who has those on average. I think people sometimes overvalue it, though, because, Thoughtseize is just part of the format. It's just interaction. You get a lot out of it, but you do go down a mana. Your opponent didn't cast the spell, right? Which is different from counters. Mm-hmm. So you want to consider it, but don't get too caught up with, like, my opponent's going to Thoughtseize me. Maybe if you know they have it, you consider it. But mulliganing, and then because your hand is weak to Thoughtseize, is just going to make your hand weaker to Thoughtseize, because the 6-card hand has less resources than the 7-card hand.
One of my least favorite things that happens is when the Thoughtseize ends up in one player's lap and the Inquisition ends up in another player's lap. I would rather them just all end up in the same deck, so that the one person can just strip my hand away, make me concede the game, and then I know that I don't have to face those cards ever again, right? It's rough. And like the rotisserie draft that we're doing right now, I'm playing a channel deck, right? I'm playing channel, and then I have cards like Wormcoil Engine and Ugin the Spirit Dragon. If I have an open in hand with green source, channel, Ugin, Wormcoil, whatever, and my opponent Thoughtseizes my channel away, what am I supposed to do? Right. What am I supposed to do? Like, Thoughtseize can do that. It can Thoughtseize can be a turn 1 play that technically wins you the game against certain decks, usually against those combo decks. But the whole point here is you never really have to worry about this in Limited, right? There's just so little targeted hand disruption that lets your opponent actually choose the card. Mostly they're mind rots, mostly they're virus beetles and stuff like that. And the virus beetle card usually ends up being like one of the top black commons. And
people underdraft it all the time. Like, It is wild how many Hopeless Nightmares and virus beetles you get in those formats when they're like a 60% win rate card.
Nizumi Informant, people were trash talking that card in March of the Machine. Turns out one of the best black commons. It's usually always good because it comes with a body there. But when you're transitioning to cube, you should anticipate a lot of the discard effects to be just targeted discard, like cheap spells that rip your hand apart, take away your best card, and give your opponent information. That's something that we probably shouldn't understate here. Is when you play Virus Beetle in Neo Kamigawa Limited, your opponent pitches a card, you don't know anything else about their hand. But when you Thoughtseize somebody in cube, not only do you take away their best card, but you now have perfect information about what your opponent can do until they draw a new card. And that's the worst for me, is because whenever I get Thoughtseize, my hand already sucks. So not only am I losing my best card, but my opponent can actively see that my hand is hot garbage and just like not have to worry about anything. That's the worst for me. I hate it so much, man.
I will tell you, occasionally you get on the flip side where you Thoughtseize your opponent and you just realize how screwed you are.
Have you ever do you play Brawl at all? Historic Brawl?
Yeah, occasionally. I mean, I've been really on that mono white, Adeline farm deck.
Yeah. Have you ever had the the peak Magic feeling of duressing your 5-color opponent and them just conceding on turn 1?
Yeah, I love that. That's great.
It's amazing. Some of the decks are so greedy that you just Thoughtseize their best card away, or you Thoughtseize like their mana rock away that they needed to accelerate to their big plays. Like, you just win the game on the spot.
Or like you mana tide their like 7-drop commander and they scoop it up. It's just like, all right.
Yeah. That doesn't have like we said, cards in Cube are powerful. Your opponent's deck is presumably going to be 20 super powerful cards and then maybe 3 cards that they would rather be a little bit better. So Thoughtseizing away a single card in Cube doesn't mean your opponent's suddenly sitting on a bunch of bad cards, which it might in Limited. If you're playing a limited format that actually has Thoughtseize in it, Theros, for example, original Theros had Thoughtseize as a rare in that set. You could get Thoughtseized, lose your bomb, and then be sitting on a bunch of bears and stuff like that. That doesn't happen in Cube. Thoughtseize doesn't normally just end the game. It just feels like that to me. It just feels that way. Talk to me about the way you approach drafting Cube. This is a big one here. This is something that, first off, we might not necessarily even have the same approach. Chris doesn't have the same approach. How do you go about drafting? Let's just use, our unrestricted and peasant cubes, like our own personal cubes. What are things that differ between your approach to drafting a cube versus drafting, let's just say, Wilds of Eldraine Limited?
Sure. I think that's a good example, because in Wilds of Eldraine, the common I most want to take is Torch the Tower.
Torch the Tower?
Yeah, it's absolutely degenerately good in that format. It's like silly busted.
So you would first pick Torch the Tower in Peasant Cube, right?
No, I actually wouldn't take it very highly at all. And that's the difference. In Cube, I think one of the biggest mistakes people coming from Retail Limited make is they overvalue removal. I think they habitually do that. In Cube, you want to be the one asking the questions, unless your deck is the one with all the answers. And even then, maybe you want to be asking the questions still. The power of some of the threats in Cube are so high and so consistently going to show up that you should be taking those. Like, if you look at our tier lists, the main difference when we did that little tier list experiment was I habitually ranked almost every removal spell like a tier lower than you did. That's not to say that removal isn't good. And in fact, some like Reprieve and Swords to Plowshares are fantastic, and I do rate them extremely highly. But on average, I would rather my removal spell come stapled to a threat. I want an Orcish Bowmaster or a Chandra or a Glorybringer more than I want a Lightning Bolt or a Thoughtseize. I want to be able to ask a question that poses a threat to my opponent, right? But these removal spells are reactive, and this is a very proactive format. So I think that's the biggest thing, is don't draft removal as highly as you consider. Like, Thoughtseize is worse than Orcish Bowmasters or Yawgmoth or Meathook Massacre, but that one's a little bit of an outlier in terms of what it does. These sort of S tier cards, the only ones for me that are removal, that are purely interactive, are the 2 white cards I mentioned. I think everything else you should draft below the top tier of threats.
Yeah, and there's a redundancy thing here, right? Because if I open a Wilds of Eldraine pack 1, pick 1, and I see Witchstalker Frenzy, that immediately goes to the top of the pack for me, assuming I don't have a Bomb Rare or Imidane's Recruiter, or, maybe Torch the Tower is even comparable to that, which is problematic for that format. But if I see a Witchstalker, there is no pack you can hand me in Peasant Cube or Unrestricted Cube where I would first pick a Witchstalker Frenzy. I cannot conceive of a pack where Witchstalker Frenzy is the correct pack 1, pick 1. And part of it is that there's just such redundancy of removal in the cube, right? You're playing Midnight Hunt draft, you see Infernal Grasp. You should probably take Infernal Grasp, because that might be the only premium removal spell you see the entire draft. But if you come draft our Unrestricted Cube, you would never pack 1, pick 1 Infernal Grasp, because There's a Doomblade running around. There's a Heartless Act running around. There's a Power Word Kill. Whatever the suite of Doomblades that we have are. And even if you don't get one of the 2-mana point-and-click destroy cards, you might get Virtue of Persistence, or you might get Fatal Push or Cut Down. There's so much redundancy of removal. Because it's Cube, you have to have removal. You have to have answers for the things going on. So the Cube designers put a lot of removal in. You can afford to pass removal. You're going to see it later on. It might not be... You're not going to get Swords to Plowshares like 6th pick or anything like that unless something went horribly wrong at the table. But you can pass on Infernal Grasp and get Heartless Act 4th, 5th pick, or just wait until pack 3 and notice that you're a little light on interaction and pick up your interaction then. So I do agree. I would never first pick a removal spell unless it's literally like Swords to Plowshares level removal. Maybe Lightning Bolt is on that list. I know some people disagree with first pick and Lightning Bolt, but depending on the pack, like, you just don't take what you would consider to be premium removal. In fact, I wouldn't even call it premium removal, right? The premium uncommon removal in booster drafts tends to be run-of-the-mill removal in Cube drafts, and that's because there's just so much of it.
Premium removal in Cube looks like Swords to Plowshares. It looks like Thoughtseize, even. I mean, like I said, I value Thoughtseize lower probably than the average person. It's still very good, though, right? It's still very, very solid, but that's what you want your interaction to look like, is these extremely powerful 1-mana effects.
Yeah, Torch the Tower is the best common in Wilds of Eldraine Limited, but it's not even close to the best red removal spell.
Very common to see it near the end of packs.
Yeah.
Not to say it's bad.
You might not even play it. You might not even put it in your deck if you have, other removal spells that you want. Whereas you would never cut a Torch the Tower over. I would play 17 Torch the Towers in my Wilds of Eldraine depth. How did I get 17 Torch the Towers? I don't know. I'm running the tables. I want to introduce a concept here. This is not a concept I'm coming up with. This is quote-unquote drafting with preferences. I want to say Court of Calls on Twitter is the person who came up with this, and I believe he introduced it in an episode of Lords of Limited a long time ago. This is basically coming into a draft, knowing what you want to do, and we'll talk about forcing here as well. Coming into a draft with kind of a predetermined mindset of what you want to be doing. Maybe you have experience with the draft already. Maybe you saw the list and you're like, I really want to try this thing out. Drafting with preferences isn't quite forcing, but it's evaluating cards or knowing that you have a bias towards cards and giving yourself the opportunity to get into the decks where those cards are good by just valuing them higher than maybe cards that other people think are stronger.
Everybody at the table at this point, when we're drafting, knows I have a preference for both. I have a preference for red, and I have a preference for green ramp decks. And so, like, there's a joke. Everybody's just like, all right, Teld's happy. He must be drafting green ramp.
Yeah. I have sat down and piggybacked off of Chris's shoulder. I have watched this man first pick a Gutter Bones before. And I don't know how he sleeps at night. Like, I just don't know how he can look at himself in the mirror knowing that he's first picked a Gutter Bones in a Cube draft. But, he drafts with preferences, and he knows what he's doing with those decks. Sometimes to the point where I think he just straight up forces himself into like a black aggro deck or a white aggro deck, maybe a little too often, but he knows how to play those decks, so obviously he's going to slant towards them a little bit.
So one of the notes I had on here, and we may have to come back and adjust this, because since our blue episode, I used to say I shy away from blue cards. Like an S tier blue card to me is like an A tier of another color. But, if you don't know, our 3-0 list for the last like month and a half have been like 5 blue decks.
And like, that's your preference of like, I know blue's not great, so I'm going to shy away from blue a little bit. And that's fine. How does this apply to limited? Like, what's the comparison here? Because I would recommend people just stay open in limited. But there are formats where it's very clear that a color is better than the other colors, or that a color is worse than the other colors. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but Wilds of Eldraine, you just like won't draft blue at all, right?
Pretty much. I mean, in Wilds of Eldraine, given the opportunity, I will draft red every single time if I could. I think to the point that I actually have kind of stopped playing the format because I think red is just so good that it feels silly to draft anything else.
Right, and that's partly statistics, partly just the data showing that, backing up what you say, but also partly you feel comfortable drafting the red decks and you don't feel comfortable drafting the blue decks and stuff like that.
Right.
Or you recognize that the blue decks are just worse, so, why am I drafting
Right,
those?
I think the difference is sometimes in retail limited, there's color pairs that are just completely unplayable. That's not true in drafting. Yeah. I think it's drafting with a preference versus recognizing statistical reality. Like blue-white in WoW is not playable, but even like our worst color combinations in the unrestricted are still playable. You might shy away from them a little bit, but if the color's open, if you're getting fed the cards, you should play it. Whereas there's times like, for example, all will be one, where if you got past blue cards, it didn't matter. You could get past a blue bomb and you might pass it for like a random red uncommon or like a random red common.
But the thing is, like, assuming that the cube designer is being responsible in any way, shape, or form, you can kind of rest assured that the color pairs should be working. Like, there shouldn't be a bad color pair in a cube. Otherwise, the question to the cube designer is, why don't you fix this? Why don't you do something about that?
I think you're also a lot more in retail draft. I think you're at mercy of the cards you get fed. Whereas in Cube, I think you can sit down and plan to draft something, and unless like 3 other people are in it, you could probably still make a workable deck. It might be less effective than drafting the hard way, as they call it, where you're trying to stay open and look at what's available and really min-max. But if you just want to sit down and draft something, most weeks you can get a pretty good deck, the 2-1 deck that just is of the color you wanted to play or of the archetype you wanted to play.
Yeah, and this is all drafting with preferences, but what about straight up forcing? I'm playing mono green tonight, and nobody's moving me off of it. How does that turn out in Cube? Because if you do that in Limited, like, you know, you're a good drafter, but if you sit down to a Wilds of Eldraine draft tonight and you say, I'm going to be red no matter what, there's a very real chance that you just end up with a bad deck, right? Or you gave up on an extremely open, like, black-green deck that was in the draft or something because you said you're drafting red no matter what. How does forcing change in Cube draft?
I think it works more effectively as long as you're in a 2-color, 3-color deck. I think if you sit down and try to draft mono green, there's going to be a lot of weeks where it doesn't work. But if you sit down and say, you know what, I'm drafting blue-white. I don't care what I play in blue-white, but I'm just drafting blue-white cards tonight. You can still get a good deck.
Yeah.
And again, it's not optimal. It's probably not going to get you the 3-0 trophy. But you're probably going to be able to have a deck that at least is competitive, which is not true in booster draft. If you sit down and you force, a lot of times it's not going to work well for you.
Yeah, a lot of times if I'm forcing mono green no matter what, you're probably chances are going to be fighting somebody else, and you and that person are going to, especially if you're forcing a color pair, like, you just shouldn't do that because if somebody else is in that color pair, it's rough. You should be more flexible than that, but you can certainly do it. And I would recommend never forcing in in retail limited. You obviously draft a deck if it's open, but don't force. Now here's to borrow some limited resources terminology here. Here's a genius or grifter for you. If you're gonna force, let's say you're coming in, you're forcing Gruul. Do you announce it to the table, or do you keep it to yourself? Do you come in and say, I'm forcing Gruul, everyone, just so you know, green and red cards, I'm going to be taking them, or do you just keep it to yourself?
So I think this can work either way. I don't announce when I'm going to be soft forcing, and I don't ever go past soft forcing. I don't hard force. But right. For example, we all knew, and according to him, it just happened to work out this way. But we all knew Jon Snow was going to force Rise from the Tide blue-black control this week in the Peasant Cube. And if you drafted that color combination, you knew you were going to be fighting him for it. He ended up with a really nutty version of it, so I guess everybody listened.
The first local game store I ever played at, shout out to Atomic Empire in Durham, awesome store. There was a guy there. We called him, he had a PhD, but we didn't know his name. He always showed up in sweatpants, so we called him Dr. Sweatpants. During Khans of Tarkir, like during that entire draft, this guy forced black-white warriors no matter what. And he would announce it to the table, and he would absolutely stick to his guns. He would be black-white warriors 100% of the time. Doesn't matter how bad his deck would be, would not deviate. Black-white warriors, that's what I'm doing. And he would sit down with a pot of new players and say, just so you guys know, I'm forcing black-white warriors and I won't move off of it. And as somebody sitting next to them in the pod, that is amazing to hear, because you feed him his black-white warriors and you take your teamer cards or whatever like that. So I don't know. I don't think you announce it like that, because then you're just giving your opponents information. But I don't know. You have to have some pretty strong preferences, even in a Cube environment. And part of the fun of Cube is you get to play with all these awesome cards. So why force anyway? You know, it's not like you're getting a huge advantage, assuming things are balanced in any capacity. Like, force in a deck doesn't necessarily give you the best deck at the table anyway. So
also, is it like the best feeling? I mean, it's kind of like in retail draft, it happens occasionally, but you get like 4th, 5th pick into a pack and you get past a card that's like a first pickable card. And you're just like, whoo, you just get real excited about it. And like, if you're trying to force something, you don't get that feeling. Like if you get past a Wandering Emperor like 5th pick, you just windmill slam the Wandering Emperor and deviate from whatever you were planning to do.
Right. Yeah. Force if you want to, but I would say keep it to soft force and come in with preferences. Or get a feel for what you like in the cube and, preference towards that, but be willing to move off of it.
Yeah, you can force if you want to. You can leave your guilds behind.
Good, but if your friends don't force. Yeah. I would say last I've got safety songs stuck in my head. Last note here, 5-color in cubes that support it is actually forceable. Like, you can say, I'm going to be the Omnath player, I'm going to be the Golos player, but absolute train wreck if 2 people decide to do that at the same time. So this is part of the reason we don't support 5-color in our peasant cube, is we don't actually want people doing that and sniping a bunch of dual lands and stuff like that. But we do support it in unrestricted.
Even there, though, isn't the payoff for drafting 5 colors that you get the Busto card, like a design mistake like Omnath, like 10th pick?
Yeah, forcing 5 colors in something like Khans of Tarkir draft or March of the Machine draft, the reason you do that is because people are going to have to pass you the bombs that they can't play, and you get these super powerful cards relative to what everybody else is playing. That's not really a benefit in cube draft if the power level is somewhat flat or everything is really powerful. You might end up with a slight power bump over what other people are doing, but just because you ended up with a bunch of rares and different colors and powerful cards doesn't mean you have higher quality decks than your opponent. Your opponent's still going to play Adeline and kill you, so you don't get too much of an advantage by being 5-color, but you do get access to hyper powerful cards like Golos and Omnath and stuff like that. But I would say you want to see a payoff like that before you go jumping into 5-color, nose diving into it, because it's a really tough deck to draft. I know it seems simple, but you need to balance lands versus removal versus fix and versus threats and stuff like that, and it's a lot harder to draft a real 5-color deck.
You also have to recognize if you're like the 5-color ramp deck versus like what Theo drafted a few weeks ago, or like my Roto draft, where you're just drafting like almost like a 5-color mid-range. It's like he drafted like blue-white control splash Omnath, and I'm drafting like 5-color design mistake splash Omnath.
Yeah, wild deck, by the way. You want to talk about sideboarding a little bit. So before we talk about sideboarding, I should mention a few things. First off, when you come draft with us, whether it's Peasant Cube, Unrestricted Cube, we do best of 3 matches, so sideboarding is relative. But I would say a vast majority of Magic, at least on Arena these days, is played in the best of 1 format. So I don't know if you agree with this or not, or if you even have like a feel for how people engage with it, but I would say that sideboarding is a skill that a lot of Magic players are lacking these days, because best of 1 Magic doesn't involve sideboarding at all.
Funny enough, I actually kind of want to spend less time on this topic, only because I want to have an entire episode dedicated to sideboarding. I think that it's a bit of a lost art in the world of best of 1, and particularly in Cube. I think sideboarding is actually more deep than it is on average in Constructed.
I think that's fair, and I think I also have sideboarding pegged as like a skill that I want to talk about in its own episode, but what do you want to say about it here? What are the things that people need to know? Just some quick hits on sideboarding in, let's say, our cube environments, for example, as opposed to sideboarding in Wilds of Eldraine or your typical limited format.
Sure. So I would say the biggest thing is usually in retail limited, you're bringing in a very specific answer. So your opponent showed you a powerful enchantment, so you bring in a disenchant. Or your opponent showed you that they're playing all 3 ones, so you cut your 3 toughness 4 drops or something like that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They're very minor changes. Whereas I think in Cube, very often, you're readjusting your game plan depending on what your opponent. So, for example, it's very common for me, even in ramp decks, to cut my Titan of Industry against my opponent's control deck, right? Because I know that they've got wraths and they've got counter spells that make the Titan less good. And I'll try to get a little bit lower and put in more 4 and 5 drops. Or maybe you're anticipating your opponent having a wrath, so you look for cards that, you look to adjust and maybe bring in a Planeswalker or something like that. And it is similar in that regard, but it's also very common to just completely readjust your game plan. I had a game against Chris one time where I was playing blue-white control, and he was playing blue-green ramp, and his deck went so far over the top of mine that I just could not compete. So what I did when we went to sideboarding, I boarded in like 5 cheap aggressive creatures. I cut all my expensive control cards, and I said, okay, well, my control deck can't win, but maybe my bad aggro deck can. And I managed to 2 games in a row curve out like 2-drop into 3-drop and run him over with the counter, using the counter spells to generate tempo. And so I completely sidestepped into like a transformative plan. And I think that happens a lot in Cube, where you're constantly tweaking and adjusting your game plan to mirror what your opponent is doing in some capacity.
Yeah, you're usually adjusting your deck to either line up your cards better against the threats that you saw, or line up your own threats better against the interaction that you saw. Whereas in most retail limited formats, there are some formats. I think Wilds of Eldraine is actually a really good format for learning sideboarding, because there's so many little niche things you can do. But for your typical booster draft format, your sideboard cards are like a disenchant because my opponent played a powerful enchantment, or I'm going to bring in Plummet because my opponent showed me 3 flyers and stuff like that. Not only is that like kind of very elementary, but it also just doesn't exist in Cube, because nobody's going to use a Cube slot on a dedicated sideboard card. We have a general rule in our design philosophies that we really don't want to use Cube equity on cards that are strictly sideboard cards that you would never main deck. We don't want to use a Cube slot on Veil of Summer because you would never put it in your main board, or if you did, like there are times that it didn't do anything, which means that Cube slot just doesn't get played as often, and we want every card that we're using our Cube equity on to get played.
Yeah, or a card like Phyrexian Revoker is another example where in our environment, Phyrexian Revoker isn't really a main deckable card. If you get into the Vintage Cube, it's a little different. But, for us, it was basically a sideboard card, and it was an okay sideboard card, but we don't want to have a card that's just there to exist on the sideboard.
Yeah, I think I agree with you here that there's enough to talk about with sideboard, and that we should leave it for another episode. So we'll put a little bow on that one and come back to it on a later episode. But I do think you can get really into the nitty-gritty, and then maybe on that episode we can talk about how to sideboard against certain matchups, certain types of strategies, certain color pairs and stuff like that, because there are general plans that you can have against a mid-range deck, against a control deck, against aggro or whatever. And then in other cubes, combo definitely changes the way that sideboarding happens, though combo's not a real proponent of any of our cubes. So some general notes here, and then we'll talk about some things that Booster Draft and Cube actually have in common. Then we'll wrap this bad boy up. The other point I wanted to make here is that cubes change. Cubes are an adaptable experience. They're malleable. We've played tons of limited retail formats at this point where the format's great. You love the format, but there's this uncommon that just feels like if we could remove this from the set, it would be so much better. People said that about Wingmantle Chaplain in DMU. Mm-hmm. Fantastic format, but Wingmantle Chaplain was like so good, and it felt like if that card wasn't there, or if we removed the little shield guy that tutored it up, like it would be less consistent, and it feels like the format would be a lot better, but it already exists. Like, what are you going to do? Cube doesn't have that so much. If you identify, especially as a cube designer or someone who has a say in how the cube gets designed, what cards make the cut, if you find that there's something that's just completely unfun or ruining the experience, that can go away and replace with something else. It's a changeable experience. So if you come in, you draft a cube for the first time, and you felt like something was really off, you can give that feedback, and that can potentially change how that cube shapes up, which you can't do in Limited. I can't email Wizards and be like, can you please take Imidane's Recruiter out of Wilds of Eldraine draft, please? And can you make Torch the Tower not do 15 extra things when you bargain it, please? They can't do anything about that. It already exists, and maybe they can alchemy it on Arena or whatever, but
I don't know about every cube designer, but I know we really like hearing feedback. We ask for it pretty frequently. We try to check our egos at the door, and sometimes, we've missed cards that people have suggested, and we went back and added them. Sometimes people are like, you'll hear 2 or 3 people say, look, this card just really is unfun to play against, and then eventually a lot of times those cards go. So we do really take into consideration what people are saying when we design the cube. I've mentioned, for example, in the Peasant Update video about people liking to stuff Young Pyromancer in their mono red decks. And so we do consider that. Like, we added some red adventures and some extra red instants and sorceries to the Peasant Cube, for example, to enable those decks. Because even though maybe it's not optimal, if people really like doing it, let's swerve into it a little bit. Let's give the people what they want.
Yeah, this matters a lot too. If you're familiar with the Arena Cube or the Tinkerer's Cube or the Chromatic Cube, like all the different Arena variation cubes, they change from iteration to iteration. They pop up once every 6 months or something like that, and they actively try to test out new things and stuff like that. So if you didn't enjoy your Tinkerer's Cube experience 6 months ago and it comes back Today, you might enjoy it differently. Same goes for unrestricted cube. Not that anyone's, come on, not enjoying the unrestricted cube. Like, let's be real. But yeah, the feedback loop is important. Like, that's the reason we cut the One Ring, right? I don't think any of us identified the One Ring as a hyper powerful game breaking card that couldn't be beat in our particular format. But the feedback was just, I don't like playing against this card, or this card's miserable, or whatever. The swords of fire and ice, your sword of X and Y's. We don't play those because we play Sword of Body and Mind. You know, that was mine and Chris's most contentious card of all time as far as the cube development goes. But the feedback was, this card sucks. Whereas if you're playing Retail Limited and Sword of Body and Mind is in that set, it exists. You can't do anything about it. Glorybringer, great example.
Gruff Triplets is there whether you want it to be or not.
Gruff, yeah, it's a real gruff time. Amonkhet would be a better format if Glorybringer either didn't exist or if it was a mythic rare, but that's just how the set is developed and it already exists, so you can't do much about it. But if we ever identified Glorybringer as a huge problem in the unrestricted cube,
Chris, Tim, don't finish that sentence, Tim. Don't finish that sentence.
I don't think it is. I don't. Obviously, Glorybringer's not. Glorybringer can't even kill other dragons. Like, how good is it?
Yeah, see, Glorybringer is perfectly balanced. It is totally fine. It's the goodest of boys.
Anyway, that's all to say that cubes change over time. They develop with hopefully with their constituents, the people who are actually playing. And a good cube developer will kind of morph things a little bit in favor of what the people want to do. Whereas Retail Limited, you're stuck with what you got until they eventually add 30 alchemy cards to the format and ruin it more. To wrap up our final point here, we've been talking a lot about the differences between booster draft and cube draft. What are some of the things that they have in common? What are the things that, if you are an avid limited drafter, you're coming to your first cube draft, what are things you can expect to be the same?
Yeah, so when we played Neo for the first time, the first couple of weeks, we all recognized that the green mid-range soup decks were kind of really powerful, right? The blue-black ninjas deck was good. But as more and more people started to force those, people realized that if you just jammed a bunch of red cards into your deck and just played like kind of a mono red deck or at most a splash, you could have a really, really good deck. And the format self-corrected a lot and became a great format. And what I'm getting at here is that Cube kind of does that too, because blue was our weakest color for a while. And I've been on the soapbox talking about how I don't think it's very good to the community and really making sure people know that like you need to be careful when you get into blue because you can get into some trouble. Mm-hmm. And I think enough people recognize that blue has kind of circled back and become a bit of a villain because people are still a little scared to get into it. But the blue decks, these blue, especially dimmer control, it just keeps showing up in the winning 3-0 lists.
I'm sorry, did you say dimmer?
It's possible I said that, yes.
All right, I'll let the listeners decide whether that's right or not. Continue.
Sure. So in your blue-black control list, anyways, these blue-black control decks have been showing up a lot more frequently and winning, and kind of become a bit of a problem to the point we're actually considering taking off some of the guardrails that we had put up to make blue a little better. Because it turns out a lot of times when your opponent counterspells your 2-drop, Doomblade's your 3-drop, and then like drops a Svelin with like Stern Scolding backup, or plays like plays some random card and has like a 2-mana counterspell to protect it. It gets really rough for you, and there's not as many ways to resolve a Planeswalker or to have a man land that can let you fight back. So Control's been doing really well as of recent. That, to me, seems like an example of self-correction where we're starting to see a color that underperformed start to perform really well.
Yeah, everything you said is under that umbrella of the phrase or the concept that draft is a self-correcting environment. And what that means is if there is a color or color pair in your limited format that is obviously statistically better than everything else, more people end up drafting it, which means they start cutting the premium cards from each other, and their decks take a small power hit because so many people are in the color. Whereas the underdrafted color, blue in case of the unrestricted cube, is more open, which means you can get more of the premium cards. So things correct themselves. That's not always true of every limited format. And theoretically, if a cube is balanced, like everything across the board has the same win percentage, then there's no reason to self-correct. But we do see it, and that's a great example of how the blue decks have been doing really well so far because not as many people are drafting blue, which means you get all of the kind of premium blue cards in the same pile. Whereas let's say the green ramp decks or the green beatdown decks are the best things that our cube can do. If you have 4 people draft in a green pile and the 5-6 mana dorks that we have get split up between 3 or 4 different drafters, you can see how that makes everybody take a power hit. Like, nobody ends up with the green deck that has 5 or 6 dorks in it or whatever.
Right. Another thing too is I think the blue decks have I think the green decks are a little overdrafted a lot of the time, and the blue decks have a really good matchup. If you know your opponents are going to be like 5 mid-range decks, control's a lot more feasible because your counter spells are going to be trading up a lot. When your opponent jams like a 5 mana planeswalker or something and you 2 mana counter spell them, that feels really, really good.
Yeah, exactly. The other point I wanted to make here is that this isn't always true either, and you might actually disagree with this point, I'm not sure, but synergy usually trumps raw power in booster draft, and I think that is also true in cube draft, assuming that there are synergy archetypes or synergy themes present in that cube. Now, obviously, in retail limited, your Bomb Rare, your Gruff Triplets, your Fawn's Bane Troll, your Archon of the Black Rose, whatever it's called. Those cards are just raw power and you don't need synergy to make them strong. But if you're just running like a bunch of 7s across the board against a deck that's running a bunch of 7s that synergize with each other, the synergy deck is going to beat the deck that's just playing a bunch of cards with no real theme. In Cube, everything is kind of rawly powerful. So you're basically jamming raw power versus raw power majority of the time, which means that synergy ends up being the tiebreaker there. So if I just have a bunch of cards that are good and that's it, and my opponent has cards that are equally good, but they also do things with each other, they're usually going to end up winning, right? A card that comes to mind in this vein is something like Bloated Contaminator, which is a just rawly powerful beat stick, but sometimes you can get those proliferate synergies with like a Beast Caller or something like that, or a Planeswalker, and that just elevates it above what it would be doing in your opponent's deck. And this isn't always true. Sometimes raw power does just kind of win. Like your Roto deck, for example, is just, here's a S tier level card, followed by an S tier level card, followed by an S plus tier level card. Like, I'm just going to keep jamming these and I'm going to beat all of your A tier quality cards because all mine are 3-for-1s or whatever. You can do that. I would assume that that's not a very balanced cube environment, but the fun restricted cube isn't really meant to be that anyway. So yeah, what are your takes on this? Do you agree synergy usually trumps raw power in cube?
To an extent. I think the difference, if we wanted to highlight it, would be, I think typically in retail limited, it is what I would call thematic synergy. So you want your cards to kind of facilitate a specific game plan, usually highlighted by a gold card, right? So if you're playing blue-black in Neo, the one I keep bringing up, you're playing ninjas, right? You're playing cards that return back to hand to either put damage on the board or to generate card advantage or whatever. You're trying to do things that give evasion or punish blocks, etc. I think in Cube, it tends to be more archetypal synergy, at least in the unrestricted. Maybe in the peasant, it's more thematic. But I think you're looking for cards that play archetypically well together. And for those who didn't watch our last episode, the difference there is the thematic would be something like a 2-color pair doing a thing, right? So like a sacrifice synergy or a tokens game plan. Whereas archetypal is more like you want your control cards with control cards, you want your aggro cards with aggro cards, etc. So I do think synergy is important, but it comes more in like synergy pockets where you've got 2 or 3 cards that interact really well together. Like you said, Bloated Contaminator with like the Kyrian Beastcaller. But even to a more fundamental point, I think you want Kyrian Beastcaller and Bloated Contaminator in your beatdown deck, your green-white attack, green-white or green-red deck that's attacking. And I'm not really interested in it if my deck is like 7 mana dorks and I'm looking to cast Titan of Industry. I don't really care about those cards.
Yeah.
So I think it works out a little more based on archetype than it does theme, and it's a little less explicit, but I do think it is still important because your cards playing well together is still just going to get you more wins than if they don't.
Yeah, and obviously this isn't like a hard and fast rule. In booster draft, raw power, obviously, it's almost like a little sandwich where you take raw power cards and then synergy pieces, and then you take the raw power cards that aren't like just the bomb mythics and stuff like that. But you usually want to start with the bomby bombs. That's why they call them bombs in retail limited. Actual question I had for you, because I'm writing an article for Draft Sim on, I think, the Tinkerer's Cube. It might be the Chromatic Cube. And one of the things that they asked me to write about are what are the bombs in this format? And this just came to mind. Does the concept of a bomb exist in a cube draft? Like, obviously you can't do the bread thing, right. The whole acronym, like take bombs, removal, blah, 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 blah. There were obvious bombs in Eldraine, but is there such thing as a bomb in a cube draft when everything's just really powerful?
Well, I mean, there's definitely cards that are better than others, right? Like, we acknowledge that cards like Glorybringer, Chandra, the Wandering Emperor, Swords to Plowshares are more powerful than other cards like Charming Prince or like Reckless Stormseeker, for example. And not that those are bad cards. They have places in the format, but they aren't taken with the same sort of priority. So I don't know if I'd say bomb though, because generally speaking, I think of bombs as cards that completely invalidate everything that came before them in some manner. And maybe there's a little of that with something like Ugin or Titan of Industry can occasionally have that effect on a game. But like, I also don't think
you have to work for those.
You have to work. Yeah. It's not just something that happens naturally. Your deck is usually your Ugin deck is going to be behind until it resolves its Ugin, right? And the whole point is that Ugin catches you back up. So it's kind of hard to say. And I think also the context of a bomb changes, right? Like Adeline and Luminar Gaspharit are bombs. I mean, I guess Luminar Gaspharit and Adeline are very busted in their retail limited formats as well.
Luminarch Aspirant was the number one data card in Bad for Zendikar, right? Like literally number one.
But like when you make a list of bombs, a lot of times people weren't including it, right? They were talking about cards like Drana or the 4-mana dragon and things like that.
A 5-mana creature with flying and a upside ability is usually what bomb means, right?
Yeah, but like in Cube, I think the bombs tend to be the cards that have some sort of very powerful impact on the game. And I think for me, consistently, it's the cards that are both interaction plus threat. Like, if you look at all the cards that I rate very, very highly, it's cards like Wandering Emperor, Chandra, Glorybringer, Bone Crusher Giant, Brazen Borrower, Orcish Bowmasters. And there's kind of a trend here, right? Kogla and Yadaro. Those are all cards I value very highly when I'm in decks that can cast them. And so I think there's an element of what makes a bomb changes from format to format. And while obviously these cards were all great in their retail limited environments, I think they have a different impact in Cube.
This goes back to like an approach to drafting. But the whole bread thing, first off, everybody knows bread is like a flawed philosophy. Like, for those who don't know, that's an acronym that means roughly like the order that you're supposed to take cards in for retail limited. It's something that's good for a very, very new drafter to understand.
Yeah, it's like bombs, removal, evasion, aggro, duds or something.
Yeah, nobody even like agrees on what the A and the D stand for, but it's basically take bombs, take removal, and then take creatures that do stuff. Like, that's kind of what it boils down to. It's basically a way to tell someone who's drafting for the very first time to take the big splashy bomb and then take good removal spells.
Which is flawed. That's very, very flawed in modern retail drafting. Like, isn't almost always the best cards in the format are 1-drops now? Like Okeeper Reckoner Raid, the Harried Spear guy, the probably a very high rate card, Hopeless Nightmare.
I mean, this goes back to your point that people overrate removal when they come to Cube because they're so used to doing, bombs removal. You play against people in retail limited who have 15 removal spells. You can tell they just saw a removal spell and took it, and then they never close out the game because they don't have anything that actually does anything. First off, bread is already flawed for retail limited and just straight up does not apply to Cube draft at all. But I wonder if there's something similar that you could come up with or use to kind of guide people in a Cube draft. And there probably isn't, because cubes differ. The philosophies behind how to draft certain cubes differ between cube and cube. So it's probably not even worth going through the trouble. But like how to approach the types of cards you should be taking in a cube draft. I'm not sure there is a overarching philosophy that can tell somebody what to do in those situations. It's more like feel out the cube, see what's there, see what works for you type thing. But bread certainly ain't it.
Yeah, I mean, just as an example, going back to the Chromatic Cube, like that format is full of like big, splashy, stupid things. And Fletch, one of our guys in the Discord, pointed out that like this 5-color aggro deck was pretty good in the format. And I had a bunch of drafts where I just crushed the format because I was playing like actually aggressively slanted 2 and 3 drops and 4 drops. And you're curving into like Joda, right? And it just gives it's like 5-color legends. And it's a very aggressively slanted deck. And if your opponent's just playing a bunch of like 4 and 5 and 6 mana cards and you're starting out on turn 2, you win a lot of games off of just running them down, even though the format ostensibly is just full of bombs.
Yeah, exactly. And if you follow bread like religiously, even in a retail limited draft, like where does that leave the room to take cards like Consider, your cantrips and stuff like it? Like that's just not folded into that philosophy. Somebody who's like following bread to the T, the T in bread, they're never gonna find those little niche cards that really build out what your deck is doing or let your deck tick and stuff like that. They're just gonna focus on creatures and removal spells, and that just alone does not get it done that often.
Go into a modern retail limited format and draft like 4 6-drop bombs and tell me how that works out for you. As good as Gruff Triplets is, maybe it's an example of a card that would be worth it, but like if you put 4 Gruff Triplets in your deck, is like, are you gonna have enough cards to not die before the triplets resolves?
Yeah, I honestly don't even think I would play the 4th one, just as an example. I don't know how I got 4 Gruff Triplets.
Yeah, this is like an extreme example too, because Gruff Triplet's one of the highest win rate limited cards of all time, and so maybe it's powerful enough to catch you up. But just, if you're playing a bunch of expensive bombs, there's only so many Atalis you can fit in your deck before you start having diminishing returns.
Yeah, curve is important. We'll talk about curve on an episode at some point too, I'm sure. But any other final thoughts about either commonalities or differences between booster draft or versus cube draft?
No, I hope people who watch this are able to take away something from it, whether you're a brand new or an experienced drafter. We have a lot of different philosophies on how to approach cube, but I think getting away from that sort of retail mindset and really thinking about the picks from beginning to end, really, recognizing where to hate draft, where to, pick up sideboard cards that are particularly effective and things like that are all strategies that can help with your win rate in cube. And obviously winning feels really good. So this is one of the great things is as long as you've got the wild cards, this is a free environment. So, you can kind of mess around in a way that is less effective on an arena cube where you're losing gems and stuff as you try to brew.
That's going to go ahead and do it. I think that's a good discussion. Hopefully this helps somebody kind of get in the mindset of how to draft a cube if all they've done is limited. And we do get people like that. We have people who've said, I've won 2 to all of our cube drafts. Like, what am I doing wrong? I'm used to doing this in limited, stuff like that. And you kind of have to adjust a little bit when you move over to cube. But that's going to go ahead and do it. Thanks, as always, to everyone listening. Remember, best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join the Discord server. Wherever you're listening to this, there is a link to that. Come draft with us. Give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals, talk about cube, retail limited, all things magic. We draft the unrestricted cube Sundays, 7:30 Eastern, and we draft our peasant cube or specialty alternative draft cubes 7:30 Eastern on Wednesdays, which, caveat there, maybe we might be making an adjustment to that sometime in the near future. You can also check out our socials, Twitter at JankDiverGaming /X at JankDiverGaming, YouTube, JankDiverGaming.com, or that's not it, YouTube.com /JankDiverGaming, and then check out Teld streaming our cube and occasionally some other stuff at twitch.tv /TeldTalks, TELD Talks. That's going to go ahead and do it for this one. We will have Chris back to tell us about his trip to Turkey next time and bring his takes on why black is the best color and blue sucks and all that good stuff that Chris is known for. Me and you had our 2 episodes lined up already. We knew what we wanted to talk about while Chris was gone. We wanted to get some peasant content in. We don't have our next topics lined up, but I know we are slowly approaching Ixalan, I believe. Not next episode, but the episode after might actually end up being an Ixalan review, depending on when that comes out, maybe 3 episodes from now. But we will be discussing some topics to bring Chris back into the fold here. Whether it's all 3 of us or not, we don't know yet, but we will be back in a couple weeks. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you all next time.
So, do you have a sign-off for us this week? Any more custom Magic cards or hot takes?
No, I really blew my load with Yeast Within last week or 2 weeks ago, and you're a Soulsborne person, right? You enjoy the Souls games, Bloodborne, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Have you engaged with Lies of P at all?
I have not. I've heard it's really good and similar to Bloodborne, though I do have to say this is probably heretical, but Bloodborne is probably my least favorite Souls game.
Oh, Bloodborne is the one I've never played, actually, because it was I think it's a PlayStation exclusive. And I didn't have a PlayStation at the time where Bloodborne was like really popping off. And I've watched like Let's Plays of it and stuff like that. So I don't really want to go through and play it myself when I've already seen everything there is to do about it. I think most people say Bloodborne is their favorite compared to like Dark Souls and
my favorite is the OG, the original Dark Souls. That one's always gonna be number 1 in my heart.
That the first Dark Souls is a game that I played it for a couple days. I didn't like it. obviously everyone knows the Souls-likes are difficult, but the difficulty spike for it compared to the games I was used to playing just didn't click with me. But there's something about the aesthetic of that world and everything that it's like, okay, I'll try this again, and then I really got into it, and I've been like a Soulsborne freak ever since. But that game, like, the thing that blows my mind about Dark Souls is the interconnectivity of like the world, where you go through this whole dungeon, you fight a dragon, you fight these knights, and then you end up down an elevator that brings you back down to the place you started at, and it's like,
yeah, the whole aesthetic of that game was great. It kept like floating around rent free in my head for years. I actually bounced off that game twice over the course of several years. So like I was in college and I got stuck on the Bell Gargoyles because all I played were easy RPGs at that point. Yeah. And then I came back a couple of years later and got stuck at the Capra Demon and lost my mind because I didn't know how to upgrade weapons. I was still using the Drake sword because I knew about the cheese. And then relatively recently, last year sometime, I came back and was like, okay, I'd had a conversation with a friend about it. I was like, you know what? I'm going to give this game another shot. I'm going to go in. I'm not going to get the Drake sword. I'm going to learn how the systems work. I'm going to actually try to play this stupid game. And I got completely hooked in a way that a game has not done in a long time and played through the entire, Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, Elden Ring. I'm working on Sekiro. I'm not as big of a fan of that one as most people are either, just because the sort of Dark Souls-y like builds is kind of part of the reason I like the game, the medieval aesthetic. I'm not really into I told the anime people I'd be coming after them, so I'll say minimal on this, but Sekiro's like, okay, I'm not really into the aesthetic or and the gameplay's okay. It's like, I could see why someone would really like it, and I could see an amazing game there. It's just not something that I'm as into. I will say Dark Souls 3 was fantastic though. I really, really enjoyed that one. Yeah. Elden Ring and Dark Souls 1 are the two that are in my top 5 though. Those are like real top 5 games of all time, both just absolutely fantastic games.
Yeah, I love the series. I mean, basically everything FromSoft does. I haven't played Armored Core or anything like that. I think that's FromSoft.
Yeah, Chris says it's great.
Yeah, I mean, that one's not my aesthetic very much. I also like the medieval stuff. I remember I only played it briefly at a point in my life where I kind of fogged out everything that was happening in my life. But Dark Souls 2, I remember not enjoying very much. And I think it's because every single boss fight is like a 3-on-1 gank fight for some reason.
It's not every
like
fight,
every single fight.
I actually really like Dark Souls 2, but I will say I think part of the thing of Dark Souls 2 is it gets a bad rap because it was made by like the B team or something, and there's kind of a different choice in aesthetic and gameplay. But I got really frustrated by it before realizing the reason I was so frustrated by it was because I was dumb. A lot of the things in Dark Souls 2 require you to be very methodical, patient, think about, like, there's a lot of stuff where, for example, there's an area where you go to this pirate bay and there's these monsters that are super strong and really annoying to deal with. They mentioned there somewhere, I forget where, but there's like references in the world to them being afraid of fire. And so if you carry around a torch, like, they'll just let you kill them. So, I was super frustrated by it, but I realized it was because I was trying to like run through the areas like I did in Dark Souls 1 near the later stages of the game where you just run to the boss door. And that game just requires you to be a little more methodical. I do think it's probably one of the weaker Souls games, but I do really enjoy it. I think that game's super fun, to be honest. Never
played Bloodborne. Sekiro didn't quite click with me. So I'm half complaining, half praising Lies of P right now. I'm not done with it. It gets rid of, there's no ranged combat. You can't do like a range magic build or anything, but it is an extremely parry-based combat system, and Sekiro was also very parry-based combat. And any game that's ever had parry, I suck at it. I suck at parrying. But Lies of P has that kind of artificial difficulty where the parry window is frame perfect for every enemy and every boss. Like, it feels like the developer sat down and said, we're going to make our version of Dark Souls, and it looks like Dark Souls.
Right.
People have said it's its own thing, and it has a lot of flavor and stuff, but it is copied Dark Souls in like every possible way. But it feels like the developer sat down and said, we're going to make this game really hard on people and they're going to die. And I've played enough Soulsborne games at this point that it's like, I kind of don't really want to have to go through this every time I play a video game now. I would like to beat the boss on my third try if I can, but every single boss, even the first one, second one, they're taking like 10 plus tries, and you can trivialize them with like a little specter that helps you out. But that thing in a lot of Dark Souls bosses do it where they'll like wind up their attack and then you like go to block and they're like, just kidding, I'm still winding up, like the delay on every attack.
Elden Ring was really bad about that.
Yeah, and that's just the thing game developers do now. Every boss and every normal enemy in Lies of P does it.
Oh my goodness.
Every single one for every attack. So your expectation is just constantly subverted.
Yeah.
And it makes the game a lot harder than it needs to be. But there's so many cool things going on with it. It's aesthetically cool. It does enough to diversify itself from its inspiration. Like, it's clearly trying to be Dark Souls with different flavor and different mechanics, and I think it succeeds at that. I would recommend it. I'm not done with it yet, but the difficulty spike on it compared to other games is just kind of like, it's eye-rolling at certain points where it's like, okay, this boss has a 7-hit attack followed by a wind-up and stuff like that, and you don't have an opportunity to heal without it attacking, like that sort of stuff. I'm just not good at parry-based combat.
I think one of the things I've noticed about a lot of the Dark Souls clones type games, the non-FromSoft Dark Soulsy games, is they tend to take the idea of a game being difficult as the fundamental reason we're making the game, as opposed to it being a result of the world being kind of unforgiving. And it feels really artificial. And Elden Ring actually kind of stumbled into this on occasion, right? Where I felt like a lot of the bosses had, like you said, these wind-ups where it's like, just kidding, gotcha. And it feels really unnatural. Yeah. I don't mind a delay on attacks as long as it doesn't disrupt the actual rhythm of combat. And I felt like Dark Souls 3 did that really well, where there were wind-ups that you had to learn the difference between a wind-up and a not wind-up on some enemies. But it didn't have that unnatural lag, right? It was maybe the enemy just wound back and then came down on you. But I think that's been one of my bigger issues with a lot of the Dark Souls clones. I will shout out one that I thought was really fun was Grime. And it was a 2D Metroidvania style game inspired by Dark Souls. And it's very parry based as well, except the window is super forgiving. So it's really more about managing the fights and like, you learn the parry is really important, but they give you enough time that, you can actually, in some cases, almost get hit by the enemy and parry in mid hit. And still make the parry. So it's not frame perfect. And I think that makes it much more of like an adventure game than a true grindy Souls game. But
that's the problem with Lies of P is it's the frame perfectness of the parries or else you get hit. And in Dark Souls there were shields where you could full block and stuff like that. I think the shields you start off with, you take a little bit of damage if you block. And Lies of P has a system where if you block and you get hit, you lose health that you can get back by hitting the boss.
So it's like the rally mechanic from Bloodborne. Okay.
Yeah, there's no full block. You cannot full block. You either parry an attack to dodge the damage, or you block and you take a little bit of a hit. And I like the Dark Souls, like cheesing behind my shield forever and using iframes to dodge attacks and stuff like that. But I would recommend it, recognizing that it is kind of artificially more difficult than the average Soulsborne. I hate getting thought seized.
Glorybringer is perfectly balanced.
The tea and bread.
You can force if you want to. You can leave your guilds behind.
Torch the tower.